So I'm going to talk today about the process of building an art exhibition, and I will also present an exhibition that I curated a few years ago. So the question that I'm asking today is, how do you build an Indigenous art exhibition while respecting the said culture and the classical academic process of an exhibition? Today I will speak about the role of a curator, the discourse on First Nations decolonization, and I will incorporate the role that Europe has played in this process, from colonization to influences in the art world. I have a little quote here by Stuart Hall, who's a Jamaican cultural theorist, political activist, and sociologist, where he states, quote, "Exhibitions are discrete events which articulate objects, texts, visual representations, reconstructions, and sounds to create an intricate and bounded representational system," end quote. So I'll go right into it. Based on Indigenous teachings and European power relations, I would like to tackle essential questions, questions that I can bring as a curator in the world, and perhaps create or build upon an existing narrative in art. I would like to use the museum as a space to generate ideas and research history, and the art gallery as the blank canvas to display ideas and encourage cross-cultural dialogues with the public. I believe that images are extremely powerful in igniting thoughts and discussion. Considering the current political climate, so more specifically, I just wanted to bring up the recent Roe versus Wade decision that overturns the right to abortions in 13 states in the United States. So the exhibition I'll present sort of encourages the audience to think about alternate modes of governance. Matriarchal and matrilineal systems have successfully worked among many Indigenous societies for centuries. So as author Laura Freudenfeld states in the Washington Post, quote, "At the time the Constitution was drafted, abortion was something women were supposed to take care of themselves, away from the public sphere. Most medical care was provided by the family matriarch, and abortions were often managed for women by women in the home," end quote. It was Gilles Deleuze that pointed to art as resistance when he said, quote, "There is a fundamental affinity between a work of art and an act of resistance. It has something to do with information and communication as an act of resistance," end quote. So all of this builds upon the idea that art and exhibitions build on each other to construct meaningful dialogues and raise important questions. So when we look at the idea of construction in art, which is kind of what the idea of the conference, more specifically constructing an exhibition, we can begin by looking at the curatorial process. So for this, I will be drawing from the book by the author Freda Matassa, which is called Organizing Exhibitions, a Handbook for Museums, Libraries, and Archives. So what makes a good exhibition? That is the question. I have made kind of a little list. Basically, these are some key points: originality, relevance, research, objects, feasibility, and of course, accessibility. We also want to look a little further into this, things like concept development, coming up with an original idea related to maybe an important political issue that's happening at the time of the exhibition. For example, developing a list of works in an exhibition, borrowing artwork, so the whole process that is involved with this. Of course, the exhibition floor plan, the way that audiences have to navigate through an exhibition space. We look at audiences and communication, so marketing, how to basically reach an audience and invite them to come and see your exhibition. And then, of course, we have the exhibition installation. So I kind of have this image just to kind of map out just the process of creating an exhibition, what it might look like. Now I'd like to look a little bit, before I dive into the exhibition that I curated, just the role of the curator kind of in general. So historically is where I'll start. Curators have been responsible for researching and developing collections within institutions, and exhibitions have been drawn, from that context. Contemporary curators create and contribute to public dialogues about ideas and art, strategies that address the world in all its complexities. They also create opportunities for artists, of course. The curator's work is derived in large part from the practice and production of visual artists, and the curator also can draw on intellectual and creative contributions from other disciplines in the arts and from many other areas of exploration in society, for example, philosophy, political science, history, and many others. And if we look at sort of the range of tasks that become the responsibility of a curator, or even an independent curator, that's contracted to produce a project for an organization, for example, vary enormously from one organization to another. So basically, if we look a little bit into the curator's role, it can be described as follows. So the curator has to articulate the concept for an art presentation and conceptualize the manner in which this art can be presented to the public. To organize and implement that presentation, representing the artists and their work, of course, again, the curator functions as a kind of go-between for the presenting institution and the artist, ensuring that all areas of responsibility for the project are being addressed. The curator should have the larger picture in mind and ensure careful attention to the artist's interests while respecting the mandate and needs and, and the priorities of the gallery or museum that they're working with. And finally, to provide professional and public access to the project's ideas and art by organizing the exhibition or the project, by writing various kinds of texts, curatorial, didactic, and promotional, and by organizing public presentations associated with the project. So basically, curators make it their task to be well informed about creative practice by looking at what is being produced and exhibited by artists and curators, other artists, other curators, and by reading exhibition catalogs, basically kind of staying informed, staying connected by what's going on internationally, nationally, locally. Curatorial practice develops mainly out of the examination of artistic practice. General wide-ranging observation over time will evolve into the formation of ideas for exhibitions and other art projects. So the impetus may be a particular artist's work, or a certain trend, a phenomenon in art making, or a growing interest in an issue, which could be social, could be political, environmental, historic, or other, that the curator sees reflected in the work of visual artists. So I kind of made a little list just to kind of wrap this up. Basically, there's things like independent curating to look at. Curators have to know the field, stay connected, engage, be part of the cultural community, be, interested, maybe write a text, publish a text, related to curating the arts, look at exhibition spaces, identify a venue, kind of make an introduction of yourself, create a proposal, and of course, stay connected. So now that we kind of quickly looked at the construction of an exhibition, just kind of the technical aspects, the step-by-step guide, I guess you can say, we're going to explore a show that I curated in 2016. I'll just kind of go right into it. Basically, by bringing to the fore representations of First Nations leaders, you'll see one behind me that I'll explain in a bit, as seen and created by female artists indigenous to North America, I curated an exhibition to advance the deconstructions of colonial notions of indigeneity. This exhibition was built as a means of making visible and celebrating Indigenous accomplishments, a positive and constructive counteraction against the backdrop of the unyielding repetition and reification of the violence Indigenous people, and specifically Indigenous women, have endured and continue to endure today. The significance of what I call resurgence is essential to the author Leanne Simpson's decolonial process, as she explains in her book titled Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. So an integral part of resurgence are creation stories, so basically like storytelling. Stories that make up a significant part of the framework of Indigenous identity. So according to Simpson, the author that I just mentioned, we're taught to insert ourselves into the story, as the artists do by capturing their own depictions of Indigenous leadership. Through the work of the artists and my selection of accompanying post-colonial scholarship, I aimed through this exhibition to raise questions about the role of Indigenous women in decolonization and self-determination, and the discourses surrounding these theories and praxis in a contemporary context. So this was carried out by looking at the artist through a particular framework that consisted, firstly, of a matriarchal and sovereign lens, and secondly, through cultural resurgence, and thirdly, through the act of creation as a political performance. So I begin my presentation on this subject with an image that you see behind me is my three great-grandfather. His name was Chief Shingwakons, so he was a chief. And he was an inspiration for this exhibition. Shingwakons was he was a powerful man. He was an orator. In Anishinaabe language, we call him a Medowinini, which is a term for a medicine man, and he was part of the Great Medicine Society, and he was also a warrior. So alongside him, or his leadership, was Ojemakwe, which is his wife, and she was also my three greats-grandmother. She's a woman that was the backbone of his reign. I mention her because she's written sort of out of her story, yet she was an integral part of his leadership. Ojemakwe was a key advisor to Shingwakons' decisions in all aspects of his sovereignty, and part of my work here is to include her in his legacy. As a matriarch, leader, and mother, Ojemakwe carries the responsibility that many women hold today, and through this endeavor, I hope to honor her with the help of the intelligent Indigenous women sharing their art in the exhibition. I'm going back to this slide quickly. So he was the descendant from his mother, a matriarch from the highly regarded Crane clan, and his father, a French settler. Shingwakons was raised in the Anishinaabe tradition and gained chieftainship as a hereditary chief and a great leader during the War of 1812. So his undying legacy serves this exhibition and the work of Indigenous women as a reminder of the achievements our chiefs and matriarchs have had. So this is of particular importance to the struggles of Indigenous women, whose foundational leadership and organizing has been largely ignored in mainstream, male-dominated expressions of the political. So, of course, Indigenous women have always been central, if not ignored, within this sphere, but they have also advanced the struggle in the realm of cultural production and counter-representations in the crucially political realm of art and representation, as First Nation Studies, Professor Dory Nason's foundational work highlights. Basically, this exhibition is called Ojema, I Am Woman. And this is kind of like the poster for the exhibition, I guess you could say. It serves really to kind of relinquish, well, that's the goal, the colonial enterprise, and display the true lived experiences of Aboriginal peoples, historically, to the present day, and finally, to assert sovereignty and cultural autonomy. So that's the goal of this exhibition. Just a few things. So within this sort of climate of Indigenous resurgence, this exhibition represented great and fierce Indigenous leadership in sort of various forms. So I just have a few images of the exhibition. So I focus on the works of 6 accomplished First Nations and Native American female artists that provide a platform for a gendered perspective that is often marginalized, of leadership that empowers not only Indigenous leaders, as usually thought of as male, but constituting that category of persons as female, and traditionally so, as the Anishinaabe Nation bases their cultures of governance on a matrilineal foundation. The lack of female representations in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous political sphere was a primary motive for my decision to focus exclusively on female artists. This was just, at the exhibition, I invited some male Indigenous drummers to come and sing and drum at the vernissage, just to support and honor the women, just to show that the male are alongside the women in this. And just a few more images. I'll start with Maria Hupfield. She anchors herself within the history of North American contemporary Aboriginal art, as well as the history of performance. So she's a performance artist as well. Maria Hupfield's investigation into our presence within the world and of our cultural memory opens up a rich dialogue between Western and non-Western traditions. So in this work titled Counterpoint Series, Maria Hupfield presents herself as a living sculpture in a series of self-portraits where she is depicted in a state of codependency stripped of individuality, where she navigates spaces of social control to connect and locate her place. So the author Leanne Simpson calls for resurgence as a way to reinvest on our own ways of being, regenerating our political and intellectual traditions, creating and using our artistic and performance-based traditions. So Maria Hupfield channels resurgence in her own work here by challenging the constrictions of the urban settler landscape in search of her own space as an Anishinaabe woman. The significance of resurgence is essential to Leanne Simpson's decolonial process. Simpson, again the author, asks us to engage in a process where we figure out what resurgence means to us and our collective communities. The author provides methods of resurgence, such as storytelling, as I mentioned before, as a core towards decolonizations. As she states, quote, storytelling becomes a lens through which we can envision our way out of cognitive imperialism, end quote. Through the act of creating, a form of governance or resurgence is deployed. Quote, create aligns us with our ancestors as we engage in artistic or creative processes. We disconnect ever so slightly from the dominant system and connect to a way of being based on doing rather than blind consumption, end quote. Simpson references the work of Rebecca Belmore, an Anishinaabe performance artist that often disputes the narrative of normalized dispossession and intervenes as an Anishinaabe presence, not as a victim, but as a strong, non-authoritarian woman. Indigenous artists like Rebecca Belmore interrogate the space of empire, envisioning and performing ways out of this space. This is exactly, what my project is envisioned to accomplish. A decolonial method to be achieved through art making. The author asks us to reevaluate the gender roles in the contemporary acts of resurgence, which are reflected in the exhibition by female artists participating. This is crucial to my own work because of the creative process of artistic and cultural production subverts our dependency on gaining recognition from our master, in Hegel's formulation, by recognizing and therefore empowering ourselves through the act of creation. We recognize ourselves in our artistic work and creation, thus breaking away from the master-slave, colonizer-colonized relation. So here I'm looking at the work of Wendy Red Star. Her multi-layered work influences are drawn from her tribal background of the Crow Nation in the United States, her everyday surroundings, snapshots from moments of the past and present, and stories that are both real and imagined. Red Star thinks of herself as a cultural archivist speaking sincerely about the experience of being a Crow Indian woman in contemporary society. Her work is expressed through a form of storytelling that narrates the Western subjugation, sexualization, and romanticized constructions of Indigenous women. As Leanne Simpson notes, creation stories make up the Indigenous theoretical framework. This allows us to embody the difference we wish to see. The action of embodiment is necessary to perpetuate the social mobilization, which is at the core of Anishinaabe governance systems, as well as many other First Nations ideologies across the nation. So in this work, Red Star places herself in an idealized landscape, each created to represent the 4 seasons and to challenge notions of authenticity and history. Feminist scholars Sherry Hundorf and Cheryl Suzak ask the important question, quote, what lessons does the past carry for contemporary situations? End quote. Red Star's work attempts to answer that question by challenging the viewer with historical misrepresentations of the Indian woman. So she aims to recreate the changing situations of Indigenous women across time and space with the purpose of attaining social justice along the lines of race, class, and sexuality. The artist Tamara Skubovius uses her Tahltan ancestry to inspire her multidisciplinary handmade work that addresses Tahltan traditions. So Tahltan is an Indigenous tribe in British Columbia, Canada. Skubovia states, quote, "I'm interested in how meaning is constructed and distorted by an ever-changing and ever-evolving society. In the piece titled My Grandma Was an Indian Princess, I question popular culture that romanticizes and makes contemporary culture primitive." End quote. The struggle for Indigenous women that stems from colonization, their removal from positions of power, the replacement of traditional gender roles with Western patriarchal practices, and the exertion of colonial control over Indigenous communities through the management of women's bodies are issues Skubovius confronts in her work. She does this by incorporating traditional pieces. The claws on the headdress are made of cast porcelain because it is difficult and unsustainable to obtain real grizzly bear claws at this time. The large grizzly bear is not as common as it once was. Therefore, hunting them is not ethical, especially to the Tahltan peoples. In her work, Skubovius also addresses the problem of hunting practices in her nation's territory. So as a direct descendant of Anishinaabe political matriarchs-in-chief, so Anishinaabe is a tribe, an Indigenous tribe in Ontario, Canada, as well as a little bit in the US, below the border. The concept of leadership is a meaningful subject for Janice Toulouse, artist Janice Toulouse. Derived from her ancestral roots, Toulouse paints images tied to the Anishinaabe culture and the teachings from her elders and ancestors. She believes the public needs to visually see images of strong elders, as she states, quote, "People need to learn from the past, to know our stories, to be reminded of those who worked for the survival of our nations in the early years of settler colonization," end quote. The artist's portrait of a matriarch, an elderly woman painted in monochrome colors, as you see behind me, embodies the powerful nature of a leadership figure in Indigenous culture. It effectively speaks to ancestral forms of knowledge and strong bloodlines passed down through generations. Historicizing Indigenous lineage ties directly to Simpson's theoretical framework, which involves an analysis of what she terms social mobilization. Chief Shingwak and Ojema Kwe, his wife, together. She defines this term as, quote, "governance that is localized within an individual's self-determination, the self-determination of families, of clans, and communities, as well as being localized within a given geographical region," end quote. Social mobilization is especially relevant to contemporary times as globalization allows us to inhabit various parts of the globe, encouraging us to enact resurgence in the context of today's realities. So Janice Toulouse creates work that functions both as activism and feminism to foster critical consciousness by attending to the meanings of history and social relationships to encourage a dialogue in political possibilities. So the author, Simpson, reminds us that in Anishinaabe culture, gender was conceptualized differently than binary between male and female, expressed in colonial society. There was a fluidity around gender in terms of roles and responsibilities. So I'm looking at the artist Olivia Witang. The historical and contemporary gender roles in various First Nations communities, such as she's also Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe are reflected upon in the work of Olivia Witang through her own individual acts of resurgence, in this case through beadwork. So she does beadwork. You can see a little bit more closely the work. Witang's beadwork reclaims matriarchal roles through the traditional act of beadwork as a vehicle for Indigenous discourses on gender roles in Anishinaabe societies, how these roles were implemented historically and how they are enacted today. Her work explores issues of access, particularly the limited access Indigenous people in Canada often have to their own languages. Her current projects consider the performative nature of language and its connectedness to life practices in Anishinaabe ways of being. As Hundorf and Suzak state, despite the significant accomplishment of artists like Witang, the attention they have drawn to 8 Indigenous women have had to contend with scholarly narratives that privilege men's work and deflect attention away from issues of gender, a problem that Witang tackles in her beadwork by pushing the traditional art form into the contemporary art world and applying a strong political message through this act of creation. So that's just another one of her works, and a bead work. And finally, the last artist I'm going to talk about is Janine Frey-Njutli. She creates work that uses sound tools in performance to articulate her Gwich'in ancestry. So that's a Aboriginal tribe in northern Canada, where it's very cold. In this work, she directly challenges the history embodied in the antlers, in what they mean to her heritage, while simultaneously exerting her own voice as a Gwich'in woman living in a contemporary setting inside a gallery space. Scholar Frantz Fanon states, quote, "At the very moment when the native intellectual is anxiously trying to create a cultural work, he fails to realize that he is utilizing techniques and language which are borrowed from the stranger in his country," end quote. Although Fanon believes that the native performing this, quote, borrowed work is himself behaving like a foreigner, I think that the native that is creating art to communicate a political action is only partially using settler mediums to achieve her goal. Or, as political science Dene professor Glenn Coulthard states, quote, "borrowing but also radically transforming these mediums at the same time." End quote. Aboriginal feminist scholar Verna St. Dennis argues that the majority of Aboriginal people have gone through some degree of socialization and incorporation into the patriarchal capitalist political economy and education system, and are therefore subject to Western ideologies of gender, identities, and relations. Janine, the artist here, Njutli, borrows the stranger's tools, such as ideas about the fiddle, a colonial addition to Gwich'in culture, while also rejecting them and reclaiming her ancestral belongings, such as the antlers and her people's voice. And Njutli creates work that portrays her own personal form of resurgence to challenge what Fanon calls a borrowed language and what St. Dennis names Western ideologies of gender identities. So basically, to conclude, Stuart Hall, who I had quoted at the beginning of the presentation, asks the question, quote, "How does the concept of representation connect meaning and language to culture?" End quote. The answer to that question begins with the cultural producers involved in the creation of myths. As the curator, it is my role to ensure that the symbolic power I hold is applied methodologically to represent the truth through the artworks displayed. Michel Foucault states, quote, "Strategic knowledge is knowledge inseparable from relationships of power," end quote. Using Foucault's perspective, it is important to understand the production of knowledge that arises out of a defined historical moment and to shape it in a realistic way by working with Indigenous peoples directly. As Foucault further remarks, while this does not suggest that we are engaged in unconstrained choice, it does leave space for agency, space for counter-discourses. Discourses, then, like power, can be seen as both constituting and constraining. Each work in the exhibition engages in specific discourses around Indigenous female agency that confront Western power relations. In regards to the role women hold in Indigenous resurgence, Professor Glenn Coulthard eloquently states, quote, "Colonialism and its associated violences purposefully attacked the status of women in our communities as a means of gaining access to our territories and undermining the health and the well-being of our nations. In such a racist and hetero-patriarchal system, it will be women that lead us to freedom. It is our job to listen, learn, and follow their lead." End quote. The exhibition, Ojema, I Am Woman, stands for the idea of the chief woman, the matriarch, passing through the mind, body, and spirit of the Indigenous women, creating and displaying their work. As Indigenous artist Dana Claxon noted, quote, resurgence is an ongoing process. We have never stopped being Indian, end quote.
La question qui nous menait principalement était de savoir donc comment construire une exposition d'art amérindienne. Cette question vient du fait que l'exposé a été mené en deux temps. D'abord, il s'agissait de présenter de manière générale qu'est-ce qu'on attendait d'un curateur et qu'est-ce qui faisait une bonne exposition. Et ensuite, comment est-ce que ces critères s'instanciaient dans une exposition particulière menée par Léa Toulouse Florentin en tant que curatrice elle-même en 2016. Donc, pour reprendre rapidement quelques éléments, on pourra dire que ce qui fait une bonne exposition peut être vu à travers 6 critères différents. D'abord, l'originalité qu'elle mobilise, la pertinence, les recherches faites en ce sens, les objets mis en avant, la faisabilité d'une exposition et enfin l'accessibilité qu'on lui donne. Et enfin, le curateur peut être vu de manière générale comme un intercesseur, un entre-deux, quelqu'un qui permet de faire communiquer l'institution qu'il porte en lui ou en elle et les artistes qui sont mis en avant. Donc ce rôle d'entre-deux permet au curateur d'avoir un rôle central, puisque tout en gardant en tête la perspective générale de l'exposition, son rôle sera de mettre en avant la voix que l'artiste veut porter, notamment en étant au centre de toutes les activités de communication, de présentation et aussi de montage du catalogue de l'exposition. Donc c'est en tant que curatrice d'une exposition menée en 2016 que Léa Toulouse Florentin nous parlait aujourd'hui. L'objectif de cette exposition, donc nommée Ojena I Am Woman, avait pour but de mettre en avant les représentations de leaders féminines des Premières Nations sur le continent nord-américain, et l'objectif fondamental était de déconstruire l'identité indigène qu'on peut attribuer à ces natifs sans pour autant donc leur donner une parole. Donc il s'agissait vraiment de redonner une parole à des actrices fondamentales, la parole étant donnée en plus de surcroît en général à des hommes. Ce qui est intéressant de voir, donc le parcours a permis de reprendre les 6 figures principales qui étaient mobilisées dans cette exposition, et chaque figure finalement permet d'instancier différents aspects de ce qui finalement forme les questions d'individualité. D'abord, donc la première personne était donc Maria Upfield, qui notamment à travers donc des portraits où elle se met elle-même en scène permet de réinvestir en fait les manières d'être au monde, et aussi d'utiliser le paysage finalement comme un espace narratif, et pour se réapproprier en fait son espace, notamment se réapproprier donc le processus de décolonisation. Donc ici en fait sont mis en avant en termes d'individualité à la fois comment finalement est-ce qu'on s'instancie dans l'espace et comment est-ce qu'on s'instancie aussi dans le temps, puisqu'ici il y a une réflexion aussi sur la ligne temporelle qu'on peut mettre entre elle et ses ancêtres. La deuxième figure présentée était Wendy Redstar, qui elle réfléchit plutôt sur les questions d'archives culturelles et comment est-ce que finalement en fait sa culture avec toute sa charge du passé peut être ressaisie de manière contemporaine. Finalement en fait il s'agit de voir qu'est-ce que le passé peut apporter au présent. Ce qui est intéressant de voir ici, c'est de voir que finalement la manière de s'instancier et d'instancier son individualité suppose de mettre un dialogue imminent entre la charge du passé et la manière dont le présent le réutilise et le réassimile. Et donc finalement, en fait, il s'agit donc de dialoguer de manière temporelle pour changer la perspective qu'on peut avoir sur le passé. Troisième figure mobilisée, Tamaru Shubius, j'écorche son nom. Ici, en fait, ce qui est intéressant de voir, c'est comment est-ce que finalement certains archétypes de la pensée occidentale patriarcale mettaient sur la femme construite dans cette société contemporaine, tous ces stéréotypes qui étaient mis, donc qui empêchaient de prendre en compte vraiment le rôle de la femme dans toute sa pluralité dans ces sociétés natives. Donc ici, en fait, il s'agit de jouer de ce décalage entre ces sociétés patriarcales contemporaines et la pluralité et la diversité en fait des figures féminines pour réinstancier son individualité. Donc ici, il y a une différence entre le discours extérieur qu'on porte et le propre discours et la propre narrativité qu'on veut mettre en jeu pour réinterroger sa question d'individualité. Quatrième figure, Léa Toulouse, qui elle en fait, en travaillant sur le rapport d'enseignement au passé et ce qu'on peut apprendre de son passé, permet de réinterroger en fait les structures sociales, leur rapport à la géographie et aussi toutes les possibilités politiques que cela peut porter. Donc à partir de là en fait, on réinterroge encore une fois la ligne temporelle, mais là sous l'aspect de l'apprentissage. Et ici non pas voir une différence de non pas simplement ce que le passé peut apporter au présent, mais aussi voir la dimension de mobilisation sociale que cela peut porter. Ensuite, Olivia Weitung, elle, à travers différents ouvrages de tissage, donne une réflexion sur le langage et ce qu'on peut y perdre, et aussi finalement dans quelle mesure est-ce que quand on n'a plus accès à ses propres mots, dans quelle mesure est-ce qu'on perd une voix ou pas. Ce qui est intéressant ici, c'est de voir que voilà, là, après avoir interrogé donc les dimensions de gestion de l'espace, de gestion du temps, de mobilisation, en termes de revendication, du rapport à l'espace, à la société. Là maintenant, on est dans un rapport au langage, au temps de caractère, donc qui permet de voir comment les identités peuvent être instanciées. Et enfin, la dernière personne dont le travail était présenté, Janine Frey Nenjery, voilà, où là ici, un véritable travail était fait sur l'usage des matériaux traditionnels dans un espace de galerie contemporaine. Et ici, il s'agissait de mettre à distance finalement les idéologies de l'Ouest face à l'authenticité de l'héritage et des identités qui étaient mobilisées. Donc, de manière générale, ici, on voit que la manière dont les identités peuvent être représentées, comment est-ce que on perd du langage ou de la signification, finalement, implique une dépossession de sa propre culture, d'où l'objectif en tant que curatrice de redonner accès à cette culture et de repenser en fait à travers des instanciations spécifiques une identité. Ici, l'identité, loin de vouloir se reconstruire dans sa généralité et donc de reconstruire quelque chose qu'au contraire on déconstruit, insiste sur la spécificité des personnes et la spécificité de leur projet pour au contraire voir dans quelle mesure est-ce que l'identité est une question vivante. C'est pour ça que je voudrais reprendre la dernière phrase que vous aviez prononcée en disant « We have never stopped to be Indian ». Finalement, à travers ce fait de ne pas arrêter d'être indien, c'est-à-dire que là, on n'est pas du tout face à une identité figée, on continue d'être dans une identité dynamique qui continue à se réinterroger et d'où l'importance de mettre en avant des figures bien spécifiques féminines.